Good morning. I'd like to speak to you today on a range of topics. They're all connected. They all have to do with the value of information, the role of innovation, the culture that would lead to that, some of the impacts that subsea cabling and global data networks have that maybe you've forgotten about. I'd like to start with a little thought experiment. This is the most famous of all the iconic picture here that's been used throughout the conference is the most famous picture of these sites around Edo area, Japan. And I've always liked this one, and when I see things, I have questions. I always have questions. And for this one, when I've seen this for years, I've always wondered two things. One, why are they out there in such a big storm? And it seems like most of the men are looking over the side. I know they're rowing, but they're also looking. What are they looking at? Did you ask yourself that question? Have you ever wondered, what is the picture of? So I don't know, but I have a suggestion. I'd like to unveil that this morning at SubOptic 2010. I think that these people might have been early subsea cable maintenance and installation people. And they're out there in the storm because the AMA women are down there diving to check the joints to see that things are good. So it could be that beneath that image is actually subsea cable operations at the time, and basically the Great Cable. Now, first I want to talk about the role that information has. Next I want to talk about basically how to think about change in technology, or at least I want to discuss my point of view on that. And then finally I'd like to talk about building a culture of innovation. Yesterday we heard so much good advice about how wonderful the differences are and appreciating differences are between cultures, and in particular, a little glimpse into some of the specialness of Japanese culture, which I found to be special myself over the last 15 years. But I also want to talk about how you could build a culture of innovation in any society, in any government, in any country, and in any business or industry. And I'll share some ideas that I've experienced myself personally through life and things I've learned from working with Larry and Sergey, who started Google. So those are my topics for today. Now, the first thing I would tell you is that the kind of information I'm talking about is multifaceted. I'm talking about the ability to, for example, see the Earth, or to see under the ocean, or to fly through the oceans and see the topography of the entire planet. Now, if you've been to the Alcatel-Lucent booth, you probably have seen something like this already, so this won't surprise you. But we built Google Earth to make this kind of thing possible, a situation where people could see the entire planet in which they live. And sometimes there are things you couldn't even see if you wanted to. For example, we all know there are satellites in the sky, but we don't actually see them. So here's all the low Earth orbit satellites, correct position based on time, all orbiting. And if you click on those with a mouse, you can see what their right ascension, declination, orbital parameters are, and what satellite is. But if you zoom back out, you can see this cloud of debris, then a cloud of deeper objects, and then, I don't know if you can see it well, but from the upper left to the lower right, it's almost like the planet Saturn. There's a band that's bright. Those are all of the geostationary satellites, the geosynchronous satellites in orbit around the Earth. They have no choice but to be at 22,000. Basically their gravitational position is fixed, where they have to be a certain spot. So all these satellites are orbiting the Earth, and you can't see any of that with your eyes. So that means that every human is disabled. It's like we're all kind of blind. We can only see things that are close. We can't see things that are 22,000 miles away, right? So that's pretty interesting, but you can see them on a computer. It's not a movie. It's not a TV show. It's not from the Discovery Channel. NHK. What it is it's just people using Google Earth to tell their stories. In this case, Apollo astronauts. We've met 3 of them, and they put their favorite stories onto Google Earth. They recorded the pictures they took and the places they stood and said, when I was here, I saw this, and that's why I took this picture. And so it's like vacation photographs from astronauts. But it's more than that. It also has all the locations of every man-made device ever sent to the moon. It has imagery from every satellite ever sent to the moon. For example, the currently operating the JAXA HD-TV satellites orbiting the moon, that data comes back to Google Earth in real time like a webcam. HD-TV webcam is layered on top of Google Earth, and you can click on that and see that on the Earth, on the moon. And it's the international sharing. There's Japan Space Agency, there's the German Space Agency, there's the European Space Agency, there's NASA, all putting all their data together. All these steps here, the little arrows, is where people walked on the moon. So what's interesting about this, everything I'm going to talk about isn't visual, but there are a lot of different kinds of information. They're not all web pages. They're not all documents, not all instructions, they're not all recipes. They're basically every possible thing that people can do to express information is information. And it's interesting for various reasons. Now, one of the things that's happened in the last 100 years, or 200, 300 years, since the invention of the printing press, is that the use of information in society as a social component, that is, as a governmental component, as a part of being a society, is rapidly changing. For example, let's see, 200 years ago, sometimes stories were told in Japan by painting on plates, cloisonné plates. In Europe, before the printing press, stories were told person by person, or religious texts were hand copied. When mass production of information and sharing became possible, it became a phenomenal element for social reform. It became a phenomenal element for societal advancement in terms of technology and sharing, because it allows the best ideas to be put together. It also became a frightening weapon of political revolt. So in every country, printing presses were cherished and feared. Governments were excited if it was the king's proclamation that was being printed. They were nervous if it was the person who wanted to be king's proclamation that was being posted secretly on the doors. So the information is a dual-edged sword. It's quite exciting and powerful. And I'm going to talk about that some more. I just want to sensitize you to that. The information societies that we have led to what's often described as the information economy. And what's interesting about that, and certainly in the case of Google, we have a business well situated in that information economy. But what's often misunderstood about an information economy is that it's not like a normal economy, and it's not like what you might think of as, therefore, a real economy, in the sense that real economies, at their fundamental basis in economic theory, there are tangible goods that have value. Even if they're services, the time to produce the service has value. And so there's a finite supply of those. Economies in economic theory are economies of scarcity. It's valuable because I have it and you don't have it. If there were two of them, mine wouldn't be very valuable because you could just get the other one, right? So the real value in most things comes like there's only so much gold. Not because it's gold, but because there's only so much gold. Or it's maybe infinite amount, but it's hard to get to, or something. As soon as you say, well, this is a great thing and you can make 1 million copies if you like, it becomes harder to understand how such an economy would work using normal economic theories and experiences. So the information economy is true, but it seems to be outside of some historical techniques for analyzing and predicting economic growth and development. So that's something to think about, and I'll talk about that too. Now, to understand that though, you think, well, what kind of information are we talking about? And I showed you some pictures before, but keep thinking, if you will, about basically every possible mode of human expression. Now, for example, people read newspapers, people read billboards, people on the Yamanote line look up and see where the next station is. People read things on napkins sometimes, which is pretty irritating, but it has words on there. People dance. Well, how would you teach somebody to dance? What would you show them? Sometimes at dance schools they have little feet, shoe prints put on the floor so you can step on the shoes. Sometimes when you teach piano, they have letters on the keys to tell you what key that is. And so those notions of information are, at the present time, not captured and not shared very well. The kind of information that you see on the web is a tiny part, a very tiny part of all the world's information. And yet we've done, as a society in the last decade or two, we've done a pretty good job taking advantage of the information that has been shared. And the sense is that if we could share more, there's more advantage to be had. And now, I want to give you a scale of this as well, because it's kind of hard to understand. This is about Google, but just imagine this. This is Google. There are other companies. It's a bigger world. The number of people that use our products is really surprising. It continues to surprise me. So, as an example, we have 1 billion searches. 1 billion is a big number. Only 6.5 billion people. 1 billion is a very big number. It's not like having 20 customers or even 20,000 customers. It's like having pretty much everybody who could be as a customer. So it means that a product isn't successful if it's not in every language. It's not useful if it's not in every time zone. It's not accessible if it's not on every possible device, because across 1 billion people, they have every possible version of Windows. Some of them have we keep track of things. Some of them have the Atari 800, Amiga. People have every possible thing. So you're serving everyone. It's an interesting business proposition. It puts you in the position of a government in one sense, which is that since your obligation is complete, your focus on excluded minorities is very high. So there are blind people. So how can they get information? There are deaf people. How can they hear information? You know, what can they do to not be able to hear? But is it translated into text? Is it you know, how do we do these things? And so these are issues that we think about all of the time. Another thing that's different about this information economy, and I'll tell you from personal experience, is that 3 friends of mine and I started Google Earth at my dining table about 5 years ago. And there are now 600 million people that use it. Now, if it was sort of a reasonable business, like a noodle shop, it'd be very hard for the 4 of us to make noodles for 600 million people, especially in 5 years, right? So the opportunity to take a good idea and replicate that at the scale of all the possible users is a unique new thing of the internet. Even with the printing press, you couldn't print a copy of something for every person in the country. There weren't enough trees to cut down, maybe. That is, the printing, once the printing became efficient and facile, it still was limited by the availability of trees. If newspapers weren't printed on massively recycled paper, there wouldn't be newspapers. So this idea of abundance, think about abundance. Abundance is very important. And of course, when you think about ocean-spanning data cables, abundance isn't necessarily what you're thinking about. But I want you to think about this situation of the value that is retained when data is scarce. Now, the most important thing I can tell you today, which I will tell you, which I don't think people think about very much, people at Google anywhere, is the chart on the right. What that is if you think about all the people on the left, the billion people who watch YouTube videos daily. That is, the 1 billion times people needed 100 KB for 3 minutes. Okay? 1 billion times a day, all right? Now, all those people, all the emails that are sent, all of everything that involves the internet, all the Google searches, all the Microsoft searches, all the Yahoo homepage, all of that is 22% of humans that are living right now. 78% of people don't have access to that. So the way to think of that is if you had 5 children, you need to pick which 4 will never see any of that information. Okay. That's the current situation. Most humans don't use the internet. If aliens came to check us out, they would say they don't use the internet. Understand that. It's not something that everybody uses. Maybe everybody in Yokohama uses it. Maybe everybody in Japan uses it. Maybe everybody in South Korea uses it. But not everybody in the world uses it. And it's not clear that what we have in the internet today is what they need. But it's certainly clear that if they didn't have electricity, they weren't going to use the internet. It just kind of goes together. They don't have networking. They're not going to use the internet. So what has replaced the internet for some of those people, about 2 billion of them, are mobile phones. And mobile phones, of course, internet's racing on mobile phones, but what preceded that, or what precedes that still, is SMS, or instant messaging. The messaging people do in these countries where they don't have internet access basically echoes what people do that have internet access. They go fishing and they come back to shore and they SMS which market is buying cod at the highest price. And they take their boat over there and they sell their fish there. That's typical in Africa. They don't use their Android phone or their iPhone or their Windows mobile phone to do that. They just do an SMS to a friend in each town, and people tell them. But it's the fundamental market selection criteria used in retail markets all throughout developing countries in the entire world. More people use that to find out where to sell their goods than use classified ads. So things are changing, and remember that you're on the tiny part. You're not on the big part. It's important to remember that. Now, on to more serious things. Most of you may have heard about the big oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. I hope you've heard of that. Now, every day the United States government publishes this chart of affected places and oil spill directions, and there, if you click further, there's little arrows and things. And if I were to ask you, how big is that oil spill? I don't think you would know. So one of the things that information can really do that's incredibly important, it's the most important thing information can do, is it can give you a new perspective to understand the world you live in. I'll show you an example. That is a map of the oil spill as of today. A drawing, okay? And that's where it is. It's exactly where it is today. Now, I would ask you, how long would it take to, if you could drive in a car, to go from one side to the other? How long would it take to walk? How long would it take to swim? How many fish are affected? How would you know the answer to that? So I'm going to show you some examples. You met in Monaco. There it is in Monaco to scale. So all the way from Cannes over to past Genoa, down past Bagliasco, past Portofino, that is the entire extent of the oil spill. Okay. Here it is in Rome. It goes from one side of Italy to the other. And here we are today. First we had the great wave of Kanagawa. Now we had the great cable of Kanagawa being laid. Now we have the great spill of Kanagawa. So we have a thing that goes from east of Mount Fuji, west of Mount Fuji, all the way to the Narita airport and all the way out into the ocean. That's how big this thing is. So I'm not taking a position about oil wells. I'm just saying that how could you debate if it's big or real big or how big it is if you don't understand what it means? Just a big blob isn't meaningful. It doesn't help you have an informed discussion. It doesn't lead societies to a good endpoint. It doesn't help. It's like newspapers sometimes or TV news. It makes you hot or excited or worried or nervous, but doesn't really give you a good reason to be. It's all the feeling with no motivation. So this is very important. Information is only useful when it can be understood. And this is even more. This is places where soldiers have died in Afghanistan, places where soldiers have died in Iraq. And you ask yourself the question, where did they come from? Well, here's everybody's home address that died. And when you click, you fly back and forth from where they were killed to where they grew up. This is where they are in North America. And we have an entire country painted with bodies from a war. When you click on those, it flies to the place. You click on each one, it shows the person's face, has stories from their parents and brothers and sisters. It's a very different experience to reading a newspaper article that today 47 people were killed in a bomb explosion in Fallujah. It matters that it's 47 people. It's hard to understand it. It's a human thing. It's very hard to understand isolated numbers like that. It's very hard to understand big numbers like that. But it's very easy to understand that there's much to be sorry for. I believe that understanding precedes action, and that efforts to encourage people to do things or change things or think differently are wasted if people don't understand what the implications are. So these last two examples kind of highlight something which basically is why governments are always asking Google what we're doing, is that information can be used both as a cure and as a weapon. Depending on how you look at things, a particular action could be one or the other. So that's something to know. So I just want you to think about that. It's a quote. I stole something from the poet laureate of the Russian Revolution, who thought art could be used as a hammer to shape society, and I believe that. And I think information actually takes that role now. Now, on a less aggressive front, let's go back to Kamakura. This is the Daibatsu. This is a picture I took in Kamakura one time, and I'm not particularly proud of the picture, but what I'm proud of is that when I was there, I didn't have the ability to control when I went. When I was there was a holiday, and there were literally 5,000 people there. There was no moment when 2/3 of the base of the statue was not obscured by groups, having their picture taken exactly where that is. So what I did was I set up my camera on a tripod back in the back, elevated, and just waited. And every few minutes when people would move around, I took another picture. And I took about 100 pictures. And then I wrote some software to mosaic all the pictures together and only keep the pixels that were the same in multiple photographs. So this is a mosaic of the median of a number of pictures. And literally 5,000 people are not in that picture that were there when I took them. So sometimes the value of information is in what doesn't change. Sometimes the thing that's important is what doesn't change. The people are individually important, but for my visit to see the Daibutsu, those people were not, they were like me, they were just tourists. I wanted to see the Daibutsu, not those people. So sometimes patience is the way to see what change is all about. I'm going to talk quickly about the meaning of change, and I think that's a good place to think about change right there. Now let's start about that. The key question to ask yourself always when you think about change is the very bottom line of this quote from a poem, which is, how can you tell the dancer from the dance? How can you tell what somebody does that's their job versus what they do that's their heart? How can you tell what somebody does that's their cultural expectation versus their actual true feelings? It's very important to understand that. And that's very important about thinking about change as well. So these are an airplane and a car of 1960, and these are this year's models. This is an Austin Mini Cooper on the right, and it's a Cessna 172 on the left. They're totally different inside. There are no parts that are the same, but visually, they're very, very similar. That's a kind of change. And there's another kind of change. This is friends over here in the People's Republic of China. In 2 cycles of 50 years, they've gone from emperor to democracy to communist organization to aggressive embracement simultaneously of capitalism to a big hug of the world at the Olympics. And so that's a huge change, where it seems like there's not a single thing that's not changed. So there's a kind of change where everything changes. So what we found recently with China is that everything might have changed, but most things are still the same. So, that's a kind of change too. Now, there's a third kind of change, which is an oscillating kind of change, a periodic change. This is a pendulum, a Foucault pendulum. Now, what you have is, say somebody's very, very poor. They say, I'm going to save money. I'm not going to be poor. And they save and save and save, and then their business does well. They say, I'm going to buy a Learjet and fly around the world and be rich. And they lose all their money. And people live that way. They don't go from where they are through critical damping to where they want to be. They go from where they are to the opposite. They don't like that either. They go back and forth, and they never actually go where they want to go. They polarize and jump. And not only do people do that, so do governments. It's very scary. And so the introduction of technology, of information, of communication, understanding, truly has the opportunity to make this worse. Okay, so for example, let's say that there's some problem in your government, and everybody can blog about how evil the president, the premier, the whatever is, and then suddenly that person is very unpopular, and they go away. Well, every parent knows you can't make it as a parent and not have your children mad at you sometimes. Every leader knows you can't be a good leader and not have people mad at you sometimes. So democracy has a sort of implicit appreciation that there's a time integral to judgment. It's not a minute-by-minute approval process. It's a 4-year process or some kind of process. But it can't be second by second. You can't make people happy. You can't make 2 people happy at the same time, usually, right? So you need to do the right thing over a long period of time and have that generally work well. So this kind of behavior needs lots of changes, but they go between 2 things that are always the same. Like the Okavango Delta, it's either flooded or it's in drought. It's never like a happy place. It's one or the other. Animals are fleeing. It's always one or the other. Now, there's another kind of change that's, as an engineer, it's my favorite kind of change, because I get to use graph paper here. This is it's very simple math. I don't think it should scare anybody if you're not one of the engineers here. If you take a step, that's L, that's the length of your steps. If you take a step like that, and you take 4 steps, that says you're going to be 4 times as far across the floor. Does that make sense? Okay, so that should make sense even to business people, salespeople, okay? So now, but imagine you'd been drinking, okay? Right, one of these, now what you do is you take a step, and then you sort of, kind of look around, and you take another step, right? So you always take 1 step, but your angle, it's arbitrary, okay? Totally random. If you do that, it's one of the most important mathematical processes in nature. You don't get very far. It was just to say, it takes a long time to walk across the street if you're drunk, okay? The distance you travel from start to finish, on average, is the square root of the length of the path you walked. Okay, that's really bad. If for example, if you wanted to go a kilometer, you have to walk 1,000 kilometers to get there. So think about that. Now, what's interesting about that, and this is super important. I mean, people don't think about this, but this is how molecules work. Okay, it's very important. It's fundamental to everything in nature and science and physics. As an example, it takes a photon about 30,000 to 100,000 years to make it from the center of the sun, where it's created, to the edge. And it takes it 9.3 minutes. Oops. I hit my button too much and now I lost my thing. Okay. Go back. Go back. Okay. Sorry. So it takes it 30,000 years to make it from the center of the sun to the edge and 9 minutes to get here, hit your face, or bounce off something so you can see. It took a long time to get ready for you and a very short time to make it all the distance from this one astronomical unit. Okay, so this bouncing is super inefficient, and that is exactly how governments tend to work. You know, you elect the one guy, and he's too much to whatever direction you don't like, so then next time you find the most opposite guy you can possibly get. And he's the other way for most people. If you go back and forth, you know, so like in France, there's always the couple of major candidates. There's the royalists, one of the king, and there's the communists. There's a whole range. So you can imagine going back and forth would be the same as staying in the middle. You don't go anywhere. The actual speed of migration is only the square root of the actual effort. So basically, systems that have undirected motion, you can ignore them. They're never going to get very far. They're not going to hurt you. They don't go fast. It's fascinating. You think they'd be dangerous, but they're really not. Now, to summarize, when everything stays the same, what's happening is that what's changing is inside. It's subtle. It's continuous. It's below your observation. You look outside and you look at grass in the park and you think, oh, nothing's changing. Well, actually, every blade of grass, its little cells are splitting, but you didn't notice that from where you were looking. Next thing, when everything seems to change and the things persist, say in the case of China, in the case of mobile phones, whatever, then what happens is that the fundamental important part hasn't changed at all. It just is a clue to what actually was important. So, for example, plain phones are going away, mobile phones are coming in. What's important? Calling mom. That's what's important, right? It's not the actual wire that's important. It's not the shape of the phone. It's the people you want to talk to. It's really important to talk to them. That's what's important. You could have figured that out before, but you might have gotten sidetracked in loving the wire or the whatever it is. The thing that doesn't change when things change, that's what's important. Next is cyclic or random change, like the pendulum or the random, just ignore that. That's just noise. It's like goldfish, very small brain. You know, they go to the left side of the bowl. Oh, it's left. It's nice over here. They go to the right side. Oh, it's nice over here. And they go back. Oh, it's nice over here. They never get bored, but they never go anywhere, right? Don't be like that. What you want is you want directed change. Whenever you see that each year there's a 2% more acceptance of some technology, you should just go ahead and bet that they're going to take over the world. That's what's important. It's not all the big excursions. It's the little continuous changes. Like if you're watching the tide, looking for a tsunami, it's not the big wave that comes out. That doesn't make any difference. It's the fact that the average sea level is going up and up and up. That should make you very scared, right? People always talk about the big things, the big excursions, but you know, people that own companies, run governments, you know, they think about the little things. So think about that. And now, talk about a little bit third about the culture. That's how to think about change, because you can't even think about change unless you understand the only kind of change I want you to think about is the kind that actually is contributive, that's accretive. Like the pearl gets bigger and bigger and bigger and rounder and rounder and rounder. That's the change is important. The fact that the mouth is open or closed or it's hungry today, none of that matters. It's just slowly building a pearl. Now, Muriel Cooper said, information is only useful when it can be understood. That should be obvious, but it's not obvious to most people. For example, most people in the world say don't speak English. Most web pages are in English. So if you want to let people find things, you need to do translation of English to Urdu, or English to Hindi, English to whatever. Well, we have real-time translation now at Google. Well, that's the most important thing we've done so far. Everybody can read everything. That's great. Nothing could be greater than that. Now, next. Progress means simplifying, not complicating. This is debatable. I believe it. You may disagree. But certainly the last 30 years of Japanese design ethics suggest that. Although if you go to Tokyo, Yokohama fancy restaurants designed by Super Potato, which is my favorite interior design company here, you'll see they're a little bit more complex these days than they used to be. Eileen Gray, who designed that table on the right, basically her thought was that you should start by challenging everything. And I think this actually is a brilliant insight, and I'll tell you that we did it at Google very much. And then finally, my favorite quote of anybody on how to build an environment of a culture of innovation is from Shichiro Honda, which basically is special because it's not really typically Japanese. It's not really typically corporate. It's it's a sort of what I would think of as sort of like an individual success characteristic, like a wandering, like a Ronin kind of thing. So here we have, he says, you have a pioneer spirit, it all depends on you, and you got to use 3 tools that are available to you. One is the idea of failure, and failure means is you try things, when they don't work, you learn from that. That's what introspection means. And you say, oh, it doesn't work. I wonder if it would work better if it was blue, if it was sealed with rubber, if it floated, if it was cold, if it had fur on it. You know, the failure is a platform for you to think about modifications that might lead to success. For most people, failure is the opportunity to go the other direction. You know, the pendulum, you know, it's too dark, we'll put the lights on. It's too bright, we'll put the lights off. It's not like, well, how bright should it be? And we'll turn half the lights on. Okay, so you should use failure, whatever kind of failure it is, as an opportunity to learn and then change things. In fact, with introspection, if you don't analyze what works and doesn't, then you are essentially walking this random walk. You have no clue what works or doesn't work. You don't know why you're going to fail, which you will. You don't even know why you're succeeding. So you can't keep doing it. So that's crazy. Most people don't ever think about what they've done. They don't keep a journal, a diary. They don't review things. Companies only review what's going to make money next quarter, not what's worked over the last decade, next decade. It's crazy. And the third thing is courage. The right path looks wrong. If it looked right, everyone would be on that path, right? So the right path looks wrong. So you got to trust yourself. Now, the rules at Google that we use, Larry and Sergey, who I work with, are kind of strange in some way. They say, we're not conventional, we don't want to become one. First thing that's important at Google, might help you, I don't know, it could help you. Certainly as a way to institutionalize something we talked about yesterday, about culture. You don't have to change culture of people, change the framework they work in. We have an investment system at Google at the corporate level of all our money we have to spend. We put 70% into the core business that drives the company. So say advertising, Google, and search. Okay? Maps, that kind of thing. We put 20% into wild ideas that might help those things. That's 90% of the company's resources go into either operating and improving the thing that's important to us, or crazy ideas that can make it better. So if it was an airline, if it was ANA or JL, 70% would go into operating the planes, new uniforms, you know, gas and safety and so forth. 20% would go into new ideas, like what about internet on the plane? What about massage? You know, you pay extra, they come and massage your shoulders. Whatever it is, that'd be 20%. And 10% is for things that are completely unrelated to what we do, that are successful, that could be big businesses someday. So 10% of the money would go to saying, well, maybe planes will be out and spacecraft will be in. Let's go work on spacecraft. Let's go work on submarines. Let's go work on whatever it is. Teleporter from Star Trek. Whatever it is, that's 10%. Now, most companies have 99, 1, and 0. Okay? Some governments that are enlightened have 99, 1, 91 and 9, where they give money to colleges, students to work on researching things, professors. It makes sense that the future isn't a continuation of the present, so you need to try new things that are different than what you're doing if you're going to discover the future. It's obvious, at least in hindsight. Then the next thing that we do that's strange is that we have everybody, engineering at least, allowed to do 80% of their time on what their manager tells them to do, their project, and 20% of their time, 1 day a week essentially, on whatever they want to, that they think would be good. So from that comes things like Google News, Gmail, almost every feature in Google Maps, like biking directions were launched yesterday and so forth. Somebody rides a bike and they wanted directions, so they did that. These aren't things that Eric and Larry and Sergey or the senior management sits around a room, we say, let's do this. It's not like that. If somebody says, I did this weekend and I think it's great and we should do this, and I got some friends to help me and it's now in 5 languages, let's launch it. That's where all those strange things come from. At Google, basically your people are the smartest and most important asset you have. Well, just let them go and figure out what you ought to do. You don't need to tell them. Let them figure things out. We had a discussion yesterday with some Google colleagues of mine and some other people our partners out in the lobby at the reception, and I said, well, I didn't tell the whole story, but I visited with SBY, the president of Indonesia, and one thing that impressed me from all of that was that they had 17,000 islands. It seemed very inconvenient to connect them all with data cables. Logistically, the trenching and it just seems nightmarish. And some of them are far enough away that you can't do line of sight radio. And everybody on those islands if you're an island that nobody can reach with data, you're going to be like a third world country in a few years. And so, what do you do? And so I was asking people at the reception. I said, well, isn't there how about a kind of unreliable undersea cable that wasn't armored, and it probably would break, but not real fast. And you could put down 20 of them, just throw them overboard. People go on pleasure cruises and throw these things overboard or something. Is there a way? I don't know these things, right? I was just asking, with no electricity, no repeater, just hope for the best or something. And every time a fiber goes dark, fails, you just switch to another one. You keep switching, and you don't worry about it very much. And I thought, how cheap could that be? And they all said, well, that's like nobody ever thought about that because that's not what we do. Basically, they didn't say it that way, but they said that's not what we do. We do very reliable splices that haven't failed for 40 years. Everything's perfect. It's like going to the moon or something. I said, that's great. There are a lot of people that are never going to get a cable then. What about the other way? So if I worked in this industry, my 20% would be trying to find some cheap, crummy cable that people could just tow out behind their fishing boat and then wire up their neighboring island, right? For example, Maybe it would work. I don't know. Maybe it's a bad idea. Maybe it's a failure you can learn from at least. Next thing is the idea of measurement. Many people in businesses and companies, governments, debate opinions. I think they would like it if the font was bigger. I think they like it the way it is. That's sort of, well, why do you think that? Everybody says you like it that way. Well, that doesn't mean anything. We have 1 billion customers. The 20,000 Google people's opinion is very unimportant compared to 1 billion users. So we test everything. Everything there is. We test everything. Color, size, shape, language placement, brightness, contrasts, width of pixel, 1 pixel or 2 pixel wide, border line, everything is done by experimentation and timing and measurement with people. So we measure everything, and particularly we measure ourselves. So in my experience, innovative organizations have a meritocracy that is actually, I'll take a moment to explain this because this is maybe offensive, but it's also educational, helpful for people. A number of times I've been invited to speak to government groups, like researchers or government groups, and they said, how can we be more innovative? Basically, we want to have something like Silicon Valley or Sand Hill Road Venture Capital. We want to have something in our country. How could we do that? What do you think? And basically, I tell them, for example, the Swiss asked me this, how can we be more like California? And I was thinking, well, you couldn't be less like California, So, I love Switzerland, but it seems like a big step to go in one step from one to the other, So I said, well, you have a fundamental problem. You don't trust people, and that's important, okay? So in most countries where there is credit to start a business, it's not really the idea of the business that's being invested in. It's the person who's starting the business that's being invested in. So you don't really trust their lemonade stand. You trust them to start a lemonade stand. And if their stand fails, they have betrayed your trust. So you only get one business failure per career, basically. It's not quite that severe, but it's almost like that. Such countries don't have technology businesses. Something to think about. Unless they're spin-outs of government technology businesses that for 40 years built airplanes and military things, and then they did some commercial work globally. But they're not price competitive, and they always talk about cost basis. If you actually would trust somebody to try something and then they didn't do right, let them try again, you would have as much of that in every country of the world as we have in America. It's just that America has this kind of forgiving attitude towards people that tried real hard. And there is no seppuku behavior at the end of venture capital. If you learn something and you seem like a reasonable person, if you stole the money or you were drinking, then you're gone. But if you did the right thing and there was a big market crash, then how could your retirement homes weren't going to sell, so you'd wait a couple of years and try some other retirement village somewhere else. So that ability to measure and trust people is crucial because it allows a real meritocracy. And if you don't have that, you really can't have that flourishing of intellectual technology. If you have that, though, you can also do the further step, which is not present in Japan, is not present in Europe, not present in China, which is why we have this great thing in the United States. Everybody, their smartest students come to live with us and build businesses that we get taxes on, which is, if you didn't go to the right school, you can't have the job. There are like 4 really good universities, at least in Tokyo, but I used to have investment from Sony Computer Entertainment and for another company I ran, and all the managers at Sony went to one school, all the engineers went to a different school, right? And if you were an engineer and want to be a manager, it's too late. Well, I'm not going to try to attack that, but I hope you won't try to defend that. A good person is good because they have passion, because they care, because they're hardworking, because they have insight, because they're intelligent, because they're curious. Not because of the books that are on the shelf, because of the books that are in their head. because what they did with things after they learned. I promise you take an astronaut and turn them into I don't know if you saw the movie Tampopo, but if you took an astronaut and made him into a noodle cook, they would make great noodles. They would learn to make good noodles. Meritocracy is good. Next thing is to embrace failure. I consulted for IBM one time, and they were the worst. One failure per management career, and then you got sent away. The equivalent of the windowless office here. Failure is not a personal failure. I mean, it's like you go fishing. Some days, there aren't any fish. You don't fire the fishermen. It's not like that. I mean, if they didn't take a fish hook, if they didn't, some things you would get fired for because you weren't trying. You weren't doing the right thing. You weren't planning for success. You weren't prepared to win. Other things involve things out of your control. If you don't have a method to appreciate that, then you basically will randomly choose the people in your company. Some will go and some will stay. Some will go, like the pendulum, and you basically will have average people making decisions, not the best people. It's so important to have the best people, to find good people and then stick with them somehow, and if they're wrong, fix them, but have the best people making the best decisions, the important decisions. It's critical. This isn't about Google. I mean, every company I know, like Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, eBay, Yahoo's, SoftBank, Yahoo, Japan, all full of people that do things, they don't work, they do something different. Big companies, not always so. The next one is to trust people. Related to that, trust partners. We found in our involvement here in undersea cable laying with Unity and the next project that really we're so oriented to trusting people that it's easy for us to be a partner. We don't expect them to cheat us. We don't expect them to do something and then change their mind once the contract's signed. We just expect that they'll figure things out and they'll tell us and we'll say yes and then it'll all just work that way. Sort of a childlike expectation, really. And I think most situations where there's growth have that kind of mutual trust. And yesterday we heard about a culture of trust and long-term thinking and maybe short-term sacrifice for long-term gain. I think that's very important. I don't think that the future comes. It doesn't. What happens is like this: good ideas start out looking really, really bad. It's true. I mean, I have a lot of good ideas, a lot of patents, a lot of things, business. But the first idea, for example, you say, let's have a dinner restaurant on a boat. People say, well, the boat rocks too much. So, well, we'll get a bigger boat. Say, well, or we'll get stabilizer fins or gyroscope. Well, it smells like fish. Well, we'll get an enclosed boat. So you think about all the problems with your idea. In the end, you have some floating dinner palace, and it's very popular. But it starts out with nothing but problems, because the idea of food on boat is the idea. It doesn't come with all the solutions. It just comes with the goal. I want to climb that mountain. And you don't know the path yet. So basically, you have to trust the people to find a path. Give them resources, let them go. Now, next one is openness. These sound like just virtues, but I don't mean that way. These are very specific. So, for example, in our company and in startup companies, same. Everybody knows everything. Every week, if you ask anybody here, there's a couple of people here from Google, if you ask them at the conference, every week, do you describe what you did this week? Yes, I did. I wrote this little short snippet of what I did this week, and you can search across that. So if you want to know who talked to that customer, who worked on that problem, who had a problem with this door, lock, whatever, you can just do a Google search inside, and you can find out, those 3 people, I'll go talk to them. So Google's not that big, it's 20,000 people. Some companies here have hundreds of thousands of people. A lot of resources there that are not available to the executives if all the files are locked in people's office drawers. Right? Now, working for Larry and Sergey, also, there are these 2 questions that they always ask, and I've watched them now for 4 years. Always, Larry's question is this really the most important problem to solve? So if you go to them and say, I want to, shield this cable better, it'll last 20 years instead of 10 years. They say, well, is that the right problem? I mean, should you make cheaper cables you can throw away after 10? So the question is, what problem to solve? Physicists are very good at this. Real problems in nature, real equations behind the behavior of real things, have hundreds of terms that control the outcome. Hundreds of, 5 times this plus 3 times that squared plus 1 times that to the 1,000th power, whatever. Some of those, like the 1,000th power one, are the only thing that's important. If that doesn't work, nothing else matters. So physicists get really good at figuring out which parts of the equation are significant to the outcome, which parts are contributory but minor. And they work on solving the important parts first. Right? I think politicians work on solving the popular parts first. Right? Businesses work on solving the inexpensive part first. Right? So if you want to invent something and do something meaningful. Make a list of problems and say, what are the most important problems? Think about that. That's very, very important. And then Sergey's point is always, is this the best possible solution to that problem? Is there a better way? To give you an example of that, they wanted to do web searching, and started Google, and Sergey said, disk drives are only so fast. The right way is to keep all the index in RAM, in memory. Don't use the disk, it's too slow. Just use the disk to load the RAM. And somebody said, well, you only put a few gigabytes of memory in a PC. He said, okay, we need 12,000 PCs. So we have thousands and thousands and thousands of computers, so there could be enough RAM to hold it all in memory. That kind of thinking is actually success thinking. Is that really the best possible way to do it? Think about that. And now, finally, I just remind you that 10 years ago, searching for something with something like Google would be very different. It would have meant sending a little postcard in to somebody at the research librarian and waiting a month for an answer. And if you think about that, in research laboratories 10 years ago, there was a research librarian, and you sent them a request, can you tell me the growth of copper production in this, whatever, and then a couple weeks later you get a report that would tell you that. That's fine. Now you would expect to do that on your phone within a moment or two. People ask a question at the dinner table, they have the answer in a moment or two. What you're going to find is when the majority of humans get a taste of what the minority of humans have been enjoying, they're all going to want that. That's 4 times as much data as is used right now. Cloud computing doesn't really change the equation as much as you might think. It changes it hugely, but not as much because the data and the processing of it happen often in the same place. So it's not so much distributed, it's just the whole ensemble is somewhere else. But the effect of it is that all the user interactions are over a network. And the result of that is that latency becomes incredibly important. It needs to be sub-millisecond latency for things to work well. And so you see companies like Google putting caching servers closer and closer and closer to users and investing in faster, not so much faster communication rate networking techniques, but also shorter latency networking techniques is very, very important to us. And then I guess I'll probably end there. Thank you.